Hey everyone, today we're going to talk about rebuilding a Vesper Centerlock front hub. It's the same process on any of the Centerlock front hub models for Vespers. To do this, you're going to need a couple special tools, a bearing press and any hardware needed to operate it, a 6805 bearing drift, a 6804 bearing drift, and a 6802 bearing drift, along with 2 speed spacers to reach across the hub. Secondly, you're going to need a pair of snap ring pliers. You should be of the 6 to 7 inch variety, long enough to reach across the hub and pull the snap ring out from the brake side over to the drive side. Lastly, you'll need a slide hammer with a collet for a 6804 bearing. That's a 20 millimeter ID. Begin by removing your end caps with a firm tug. Each end cap is seated with an O-ring and can be pulled out by hand. Next, we're going to remove the bearings. You'll notice that you cannot pull any of the bearings out through the brake side of the hub and instead have to pull everything from the drive side. Go ahead and take your slide hammer and open the collet so that you can fit it into the 6804 bearing. Be careful not to install it too far, as you want to grab just the bearing and not the sleeve between the 2 bearings inside the hub. Go ahead and give the tool a wiggle to make sure you're seated. If you're not, go ahead and reset until you are able to latch onto just the bearing. Once seated, go ahead and take a firm grip of your hub and use a slide hammer to extract the bearing. This may cause the center sleeve to come out with the bearing once it releases from the shell. Now you can go ahead and discard the old bearing or set it aside for cleaning. At this point, you want to inspect the center spacer from the hub. Should have nice and square edges on both ends. Damage would be in the form of gulling or burrs or any kind of corrosion. If this is found, go ahead and order a replacement before installing new bearings. Let's go ahead and remove the brake side bearing. To do so, you'll have to remove the 2 snap rings in the hub shell. The brake side bearing is extracted by pushing across the shell to be able to grab with your slide hammer and extract from the drive side. Go ahead and take your snap ring pliers, take a firm hold on each snap ring, and remove from the hub shell. Now that the snap rings are removed, let's take a look at them. You'll notice that there is a flat side and a rounded side to each snap ring. You want to make sure that the rounded side is facing the bearings whenever installed into the hub. Now let's prep to take out the brake side bearing. To do this, you're going to need to push the bearing from the brake side of the hub across to the drive side using your bearing press, and then later your slide hammer to extract it from the shell. Let's start by loading up your bearing press. We're going to use our little 6804 drift as a stop. We're going to install both speed spacers and your 6802 bearing drift. This is going to go against the brake side bearing of the shell. Your 6805 drift is going to be used to push flat against the drive side of the hub shell in order to press the bearing across. Depending on your bearing press, you may need to adjust it slightly in order to be able to accommodate this long reach. Take your time and be sure that your drifts and bearing press are centered in the hub shell. Once centered, go ahead and begin the press process. You'll notice that the bearing will pop free into a recess in the center of the hub shell. There's a slight taper against the drive side to help pick the bearing back up again. Depending on your bearing press, you may have to reset the tool once more in order to be able to reach that far across the shell. Take your time to go ahead and center the press and retighten. Remember that the drift on the drive side of the hub shell is used to keep yourself center and square. Resume the press process and continue pushing the bearing towards the drive side of the hub shell. Now you'll want to continue this until your bearing press bottoms out or until the bearing is pressed firmly against the drift on the drive side of the hub shell. Then go ahead and undo your bearing press tool from the hub. You'll now see that the bearing is close enough to the drive side to be able to reach with your slide hammer for extraction. Go ahead and set your bearing press tools aside. You're going to need these again when reinstalling bearings to the hub shell. You're now ready to remove the bearing from the drive side of the hub. You've now pushed it close enough so that your slide hammer can reach in. So go ahead and install the slide hammer into the bearing. Be sure it is securely fastened. Take a firm grip of your hub and use the hammer motion to remove the bearing. Once removed, now you can go ahead and clean the inside of the hub shell. You can proceed to cleaning or discarding of your old bearing from the slide hammer as well. Alright, now let's get this hub back together. We're going to start with a fresh set of steel bearings. You'll notice that the bearings have a gray seal. This is an outboard facing seal, while the inside of the bearing has a black seal. If our ceramics, the outboard facing seal will be orange. Now, because we're going to push the bearing all the way across from the drive side to the brake side, be sure you face the seals in the correct orientation. Now, let's go ahead and load up our bearing press with our speed spacers and the 6804 bearing drift to install the brake side bearing. Be sure to remember seal orientation when you install the bearing onto the drift. Go ahead and set your bearing press using your 6805 drift against the center lock brake flange on the brake side of the hub. Again, take your time to center before beginning your press process. Now, opposite of the removal, you're going to be pushing the bearing all the way across the shell. You have a long way to go with your bearing press. Go ahead and take your time pushing the bearing across, using your tools and a firm grip on the hub to guide it along the way. Now, just like before, you're going to feel the bearing pop into the crevice in the center of the hub shell. You're going to need to reset your bearing press in order to complete the press process against the brake side of the hub. Once reset, you can go ahead and continue the press process. Now that the bearing is firmly pressed against the brake side of the hub shell, you can go ahead and release your bearing press and remove all drifts and spacers from the hub assembly. Now we get to reinstall the snap rings into the hub shell. Keep in mind there is the orientation of the snap ring. The flat side should be facing away from the bearing, rounded side facing towards the bearing. Be sure to remember this orientation when installing it onto your snap ring pliers and pressing into the shell. Be sure and check that the snap ring is open and is securely in the groove. Now, before installing your center spacer, we're going to install the drive side snap ring. Be sure the rounded side is facing outward, as the drive side bearing will press against this. Now you can go ahead and drop in your center spacer. Use your finger to align it until it is sitting against the brake side bearing and not sideways against either of the snap rings. You want to keep the hub horizontal from this stage forward, as we don't want the spacer to lean left or right and get pressed against the snap rings when you press the drive side bearing in. Go ahead and get your bearing press ready with your 6804 bearing drift and load up your 6804 bearing with the heavy seal facing outward. We want to keep the hub vertical, so we're actually going to install the drive side bearing with the hub shell facing upwards, brake side facing up, and the weight of the shell and the sleeve down against your bearing press. Go ahead and install your 6805 drift and adjust your press until you are square and centered and ready to begin the press process. Go ahead and press the drive side bearing into the hub shell using your tools while maintaining the hub in a vertical stance. Once the bearing has firmly pressed against the snap ring, you can go ahead and remove your bearing press, and you want to inspect that the center spacer is still free floating between the two bearings. If the spacer is not free, it may be wedged against one of the snap rings, and you may have to extract a bearing and try again. Now in the final stages, you're ready to install your end caps and get this hub back on your bike. Go ahead and clear your tools and begin with the brake side end cap, which is the small flange, and press it into the bearing on the brake side. Press down until you feel a firm pop. Now repeat on the drive side using the end cap that has a larger flange, and press into the center of the shell until you feel a firm pop as well. You are now done completely overhauling your front hub, and you're ready to get back on the trail.